Look, good afternoon. It's great to get a chance to talk to you about probably what is one of the most fast emerging sectors of the power industry in Europe, but you'd have to say more laterally Ireland, and that's reflected by the huge turnout here today. I'm going to talk about three things really. There is going to be some overlap with the two previous presentations, so bear with me on that. But first of all, I'm going to briefly touch on the different grid delivery models that are out there. I'm going to keep it a little bit more high level, maybe than Kieran and Kay would have gone into. I'm going to talk about the options paper and really introduce it. We're at the very early stages of that, but to maybe give you a flavour of the different factors that we're looking at as we look to draft the options paper. And finally, I'm going to talk about the East Coast study. It's a document that is probably a lot of the people in the audience are aware of, but in EirGrid it's something we keep getting asked about, so I think I'm going to take the opportunity to just raise the awareness of what I believe is a very good piece of analysis by EirGrid, and which to a fair extent is focused on the offshore industry. So the different types of grid delivery models, I'm not going to labour it. I think Kieran and I think I have to say Kate as well really went through it in a lot of detail. Look, there's a centralised model that Denmark and the Netherlands have up and running. So that's where the TSO or the TAO would build a transmission and carry out the permitting necessary for the offshore wind farm. And then the developer would effectively build the wind farm. And look, sorry, that's reflected, a very simple diagram here. Red is the grid connection on the right-hand side, black is the offshore wind farm itself, and then green is the permitting associated with it. The decentralized, so that's the centralized model. At the very other end of the spectrum, you have the decentralized model, or as Kieran called it, it's the developer-led approach. And that's been very successfully implemented in Great Britain, and it looks like the US is going to go down that path also. And that's where the developer does the whole lot. It builds the transmission, gets the permitting, and builds the offshore wind farm itself. And then somewhere in the middle, it's the hybrid approach, and that's what Germany currently has at the moment. So that's where the TO or TSO basically builds the transmission. I think they call it a plug, so basically build a big power station out at sea, and then offshore wind farms can connect into it. So the TSO-TAO builds the grid offshore, and the wind farm developers do the rest. And like was alluded to earlier on, these models are always evolving. Even in Denmark and Germany, and you know they've been working on this for a number of years now, and indeed they have operational offshore wind farms of scale. But they're all the time tweaking their models as well. So, for example, Denmark are changing their approach for near shore. Germany are looking at their approach with regard to availability of the offshore grid infrastructure. So this space, it isn't standing still. EirGrid, under the Climate Action Plan, has been asked to develop an options paper on the different offshore grid models that are out there. So effectively, it's an information paper, and this graphic, what it effectively represents is EirGrid will pull together the options paper or the information paper, and then that will feed into, I suppose, ultimately decisions by the department and the regulator on the policy and regulatory framework going forward. The due date for this is March 2020, so approximately 6 months' time, and as I said, we're at the early stages of this. EirGrid is in the process of appointing of reviewing tender submissions for external consultants who will do a lot of this analysis in tandem with EirGrid. Just a high-level scope, I mean, if it's to break it down into 3 different things, first of all, we're going to look at the different models that are out there in Europe at the moment and try to capture the latest developments in this space. Talk about, like, what does it mean for the different parties? So if you're a generator, if you're a system operator, if you're a consumer, look at it through those different lenses. And then finally look at the costs, the benefits, the risks associated with the different options. So look, in this options paper, it's going to look at it. There's a lot of different considerations, and I'm not going to go into all of them now, and this isn't all of them, but we're going to try and look at this through as many different lenses as possible, really to try and, I suppose, really come up with a really strong assessment of the options that are out there. But really it's true, what's the applicability to Ireland? That's ultimately the lens that we have to look at. There's no point in pulling together an academic paper of what's out there. It all has to be looked at through an Ireland context. So look, it is great that there are other jurisdictions that they've established models, and I'm sure there's a lot of lessons that we can and will learn from the implementation of that. But at the same time, we have our own system, we have our own, I suppose, unique requirements as an industry, and that needs to be reflected. So the different things we're going to look at, and I think Kieran and Kate would have touched on them, like factors like the speed of delivery of the grid connection, looking at it from a consumer's perspective, which is the cheapest from there. Like obviously a key factor we all have to consider as we look out into the next decade and meeting RES targets is, well, what's it going to cost to the consumer? Future scalability and synergies. I know John is going to talk about the supernode. I think in this case, this option paper will look at the challenges of the next decade, but at the same time, we as an industry always have to be cognizant of the future as well, and not do something today that makes it very complicated as we look out into the future. It's going to look at emerging technologies as well, social acceptance, tease that out. Is that any different for the different models? Look, we're going to consider other issues, but I just wanted to give a flavour of the different angles that we're going to look at this issue through. So that paper, we're targeting end of March 2020 to have that delivered. Last thing I wanted to touch on is the East Coast study. So this was analysis that was carried out by my planning colleagues in the spring of this year. And it was actually published there in late February. And I guess, look, within Ireland, it's clear that a lot of our demand is in the Dublin area, and really for predominantly due to the amount of data centres that are connecting in Ireland, there's going to be a lot of demand growth in the Dublin and indeed the East Coast area. And again, there was a lot of interest from offshore wind farms in collecting along the East Coast. So we carried out an analysis to look at capacity for offshore winds. We looked at what's available right now to connect for a notional 800 megawatts off the east coast of Ireland. It also looked at thermal generation and spare bays, but I suppose considering the audience, what was the capacity for offshore wind is the thing of most interest. This document is published on the EirGrid website. It's very familiar to some people, to those that it isn't. I would recommend that you give it a read. It really gives a good flavour of the transmission capacity along the east coast of Ireland. I suppose the simple message, this shows, the graphic on the left shows effectively the transmission network going from Dundalk kind of down to Wexford really, with Dublin in the middle. And I've really split it into 3 zones. So the closer you are to Dublin, the more existing transmission capacity is there. And again, that's probably not a surprise. It's in some ways it's intuitive. That's where your major demand is. So we looked at 9 different stations along the east coast, and at each of those stations looked at how many megawatts could we accommodate before we started to see problems on the transmission network. And look, as you can see there within the Dublin area, HighLevel can accommodate 800 megawatts. North of Dublin, the closer you are to Dublin, the more we can accommodate, but it varies between 400 and 800 megawatts. And south of Dublin, it's again 350 to 600 megawatts south of Dublin. Obviously, reinforcements, which are identified in the particular study, show how that could be brought up to 800 megawatts at all 9 locations which were analysed. It should be noted that this isn't cumulative. I guess that's not how a transmission system works. If you put something here, it has an impact over here. But look, it does give a very good guide of the transmission capacity along the East Coast. Look, I suppose that's really it for me. I think there's a lot of interest in connecting renewables out into the next decade. We're going to, per the Climate Action Plan, at least 3.5 gigawatts of offshore wind. There's a lot of different models there's probably 3 different models that are out there with some variations or nuances in between. We're working on an options paper at the moment, and we're targeting having that complete in March of this year. And I would recommend for those of you who are interested in getting a flavour of some of the capacity, particularly along the East Coast, have a look at the East Coast study, which breaks that out. It's quite an accessible paper. So that's it. Thank you.